All right. Thanks a bunch. Thanks a bunch, Justin. Um, Thank you all for attending. I've got a lot of content, so we're gonna just move right into it and hopefully leave plenty of time for questions. But I do like this topic at fire breaks because I've been burning for quite a number of years right now, and I just know how important a well-designed, well-installed fire break is. It's all the difference between a really bad burn day and a really good one. And I've seen a lot of people not put in great fire lines. So we wanted to put this here and do this talk just to kind of go over kind of what are the things you need to think about? What are some of the rules of thumb that you use when you're designing and installing a fire break? So I would imagine I've got a lot of difference in experience in the crowd in terms of how much burning you've done. So I'll just start real basic and move from there. So a fire break, what is a fire break? It's really it's a section of non-combustible fuels. So it may be mineral soil or something that's not going to burn, and it's a sufficient width, so it's large enough that it's going to prevent that advancement of the fire. You put a fire break along the entire perimeter of your burn unit, so the area that you want to burn should have a fire break completely along the perimeter, and it contains that fire within your unit what you're going to burn. You call them fire breaks, you call them fire lines, whichever one you want. But the idea is it contains that fire and it prevents it from escaping and burning areas that you do not intend to burn. And it really is a critical component of any prescribed fire operation. It's needed for the safety of the crew, for protecting any place outside of your burn unit from getting burned. A good fire break makes for an easy fire. A bad fire break makes for an angry burn crew. The harder it is to deal with fire trying to creep across those fire breaks or to jump across and spot in other areas, it just makes for a much more difficult fire to implement. And fire breaks are very important simply because almost all of the ignition operations and the majority of all the actions that happen in a prescribed fire typically happen immediately adjacent to that fire break. So it's an area where a lot of that work's going to happen. So having that laid out, well designed, is very important. A bad fire break might be one that's too narrow for your burn conditions, and so it does not adequately stop the flames from reaching across. It could be poorly located, so it's difficult to access. It could be in an area where the fire behavior tends to be a little more extreme. It could be improperly installed or improperly prepped, so it is not actually fireproof. It's not actually non-combustible, right? And so you let the fire can actually creep through it. And so these bad fire breaks, they can result in the safety of the crew being compromised, definitely a lot more work for the burn crew. Bad fire lines often means you need a larger burn crew to contain that fire. It's going to slow you down, so your operations are going to be a lot slower, so it's going to take a lot more time to burn that fire. And it could certainly result in more escapes, more spot fires as well. And so hopefully that kind of outlines why we want to have good fire breaks. And so this presentation will kind of go over several things. And at first, we'll really focus on the influences that are on fire behavior. So how does moisture, relative humidity, wind direction, topography, the types of fuel you're burning, how do all those influence fire behavior? And then how does that relate to fire break design and fire break siting or location? Then we'll get into some rules of thumb for fire break design in terms of how wide they need to be and things like that. The tools and methods you can use to install fire breaks, and then end with a couple of techniques that we often use, whether it's wet lining or prepping snags and prepping jackpot fuels near fire breaks. We'll end with those. So again, influences on fire behavior. These four features here, moisture, relative humidity, wind, topography, and fuel type, can greatly influence your fire behavior, how it acts, the size, the speed of the advancement of your fire. And so moisture and relative humidity, it's no surprise. It shouldn't become as a shock, but dry fuels tend to burn more intensely. right? Finer fuels, so not heavy woodies, but grasses, leaves, things like that, dry out faster than heavier fuels, and so they can react quicker to changes in humidity and changes in moisture. And overall, on days that the relative humidity is over 60% or so, oftentimes these fine fuels are really too wet to burn very well, and you'll have fire that's kind of hard to carry, hard to move through areas. And then when relative humidities get less than about 20%, those fine fuels often get very dry, and then fire behavior can actually be dangerous and a little harder to contain at that point. So we kind of like that sweet spot in that 30 to 40% relative humidity tends to be where fire behavior is adequate enough to burn and combust what you're looking for, but still pretty easily containable. And you can see here, this is the same fuel type. So we have pine needle leaf litter on the ground. And we have two different moisture conditions. So the one on the left, this is where somebody came through trying to ignite a fire with their drip torch, and you can see the fire burned basically until the drip torch fuel was fully combusted and then did not carry any further into those pine needles. Compare that to the scene on the right where you had complete combustion of all those needles on the ground layer. Same fuel type. The only difference here was fuel moisture. We had really high fuel moisture on the left and adequate fuel moisture, dry fuel moisture for carrying the fire on the right. And so again, relative humidity, fuel moisture, major factor on how fire is going to behave. Probably one of the most important things to consider when designing a fire and laying one out and siting your fire lines would be wind. So wind is very important with in terms of influence on fire behavior. So what we call a backing fire is when the fire is trying to burn against the wind. So the wind is pushing the fire away from the fuels, and so it has to kind of creep slowly into the fuels and kind of fight against that wind to burn. And so that typically results in fires that are lower intensity, very slow moving fires because it's not getting pushed into new fuels. It's actually getting pushed away from the fuels and has to just creep into there. Contrast that with a heading fire, which is one that is the fire is blowing, the wind is blowing the fire into the fuels, and so as the flames bend down and move with the wind, they're easily finding new fuels to ignite. And so heading fires or wind that's pushing the fire results usually in faster and much more intense fires. And so just an example here, you can see the wind direction is from the upper right of this picture, and the ignition and the fires coming from the lower left of this picture. And you can see all the new fuels that the fire is trying to combust uh, is towards the wind. So the wind is pushing the fire away. And you can see this is a low flames. This is a slow moving fire, not very intense flames. So contrast that with what happened when the firing operations got around to the other side of this burn unit. And suddenly the ignitions were basically lighting the fire on the upwind side, and the wind was pushing the fire into the fuels, and see how much more intense, higher those flames are. The fire's moving a lot faster with this wind, right? And so on the left of this picture, it's still a backing fire. And on the right of this picture is kind of a flanking side fire, but also a little bit of a heading fire. And you can really see the differences right there between those two. I do have a short video embedded in here. Hopefully it works over Zoom that could really demonstrate this. So this is a small unit. Look at the right. That's a backing fire, and the left is a heading fire. You can see the winds coming from the left, and just look at the difference in fire behavior from the left to the right, how much more intense the fire on the left is and how much faster it was moving. Alrighty, so that's wind. In terms of topography, it's kind of the same thing. It's basically are the flames reaching new fuel or not? So when fire is burning downhill, um, the flames rise up, go higher, right? So they're going away from the fuels. They're pointing into areas that have already been burned. The fuels have already been combusted. And so from that, you typically have a lower intensity, slower moving fire, very similar to a backing fire in the wind. Fire's burning uphill. As the flames rise up, they're reaching into new fuels, right? And so they're actually moving into the fuels and getting kind of getting pushed into new fuels. And so this is very much like a heading fire with wind. Uphill burning fires tend to be faster, more and have more intensity. And so you can see that here, right? So this is a downhill fire. It was started up the hill and it's backing its way downhill. You can see the fuels are below the fire in this case, and everything above the fire up the hill has already been burned. You can see these flames are 6, 7, 8 inches tall max. Now, this next picture, this was taken in the same area, just around the hill a little bit. The big difference was the ignitions happened right at the base of this hill, and so these flames are moving uphill. You can see the fuels to be combusted are above the flames, and so this fire is moving uphill. You can see these flames lengths are 14, 16 inches, moving higher, a much more intense burn than the last picture that where the flames are going downhill. And so if you look at either one of these, wind or topography, so a backing fire, one that's going against the wind or that's backing downhill, we use those because they're less intense fires. We often use those to widen a fire break before we do a heading fire. We would never want to have a fire kind of head into and go to that intense fire from the heading into one of our fire breaks right away because it's going to push the limits of those fire breaks and be much more likely to jump across the line. So we often start with a backing fire right against our fire break, knowing that it's going to be less intense, slower moving, a little easier to contain, and less pressure on our fire breaks. And then actually, as that burns and creeps away from our fire line, it's actually increasing the width of our fire rate because that burned, combusted area, that blackened ground, is non-combustible now, and so it basically is an extension of our fire break, right? And this picture shows that, right? So we have the wind direction coming from the right, and we had a fairly narrow fire break on the left, but as the fire is backing slowly through there. Now, all of that black is also non-combustible, so it's making our fire break larger and larger. So when we do have a heading fire, it's going to have a much wider span to have to jump across if it's going to escape our burn unit. In terms of your fuel source, if you're burning in fuels that are primarily leaf litter, so you don't have a lot of herbaceous vegetation, there's not a lot of grasses, wildflowers, or anything standing up. Mostly what you're burning are tree leaves on the ground. That's usually a fairly unimpressive fire if you're not used to fire. So it typically the flame lengths are going to be under a foot tall. It's going to be fairly easygoing fire, something like that. And so those are much lower intensity, much cooler, much shorter flame lengths than grass fires. And so that's kind of what you expect when you're burning in a lot of primarily leaf litter fires. Compare that to primarily grasses and forbs. Those are usually taller vegetation and you usually have much higher flame lengths and much more intense fire behavior. And so kind of knowing what your primary fuel source is kind of lets you, it's really important to know that when you're laying out and building your fire break because you know how wide to make them and things like that. There are some fuel sources that tend to be extreme. So I don't know if anybody here has burned miscanthus or phragmites before, but both of those are very, very tall exotic grasses that have at times extreme fire behavior, right? They're often 10, 12 feet tall grasses. And so this is a picture where we burned a small miscanthus unit And it was a high fuel moisture day. It was actually drizzling at this point, but we still had 30 or 40-foot flame lengths on this miscanthus. And so there are a few fuel sources that are just absolutely extreme. So how does that all kind of factor into your fire break? And so there is a rule of thumb. And in general, you should make your fire break 3 times as wide as you expect those flame lengths to be, or 3 times the height of the nearest surface vegetation if you want to go that way, right? So that ideally even a little wider is better, but that's kind of your minimum width that you should really make your fire breaks would be 3 times as wide as you expect the height or the length of those flame lengths. And so applying that to real world conditions. So if you're in a leaf litter burn, so you're burning an oak forest there where there's not a lot of herbaceous vegetation in the understory, it's basically just leaves. As I mentioned earlier, those are typically 8-inch to maybe 24-inch, 2 feet or so flame lengths. It varies very much depending on your wind speed, the fuels, the topography, all of these things. But in general, 2 feet flame lengths is kind of the maximum you often get in just pure leaf litter. And so, in that case, we would need fire breaks that range in that 3 to 6 foot width, typically closer to 6 foot. If that's you're burning typically in leaf litter. Now, if you're in a savanna or a woodland or an open forest situation where you have a lot more vegetation, a lot of grasses that have dried out, a lot of forbs in there, and it's a lot taller, you can expect more intense fire behavior in that case, and so you would want to widen your fire breakout accordingly for sure. But if it's just leaf litter, we're typically looking at fairly small fire breaks. Again, 3 to 6 feet. And so sometimes it's surprising to people at just how small a fire break often is in these leaf litter situations. This one is about 3 feet, and it did a fantastic job. It held the fire very easily in this case. Now, if you're burning in grassland burns, again, they vary wildly in their flame length, but oftentimes we're looking at 5 to 10 foot flame lengths in grasslands. It's going to be a little higher if you're dealing with tall grasses like big blue stem or something like that. So you're going to need fire breaks that are much bigger than forest fire breaks. You're looking at 15 to 30 feet at times for a fire break. That can be a pretty big fire break to install. There are practices you can do to reduce the width a little bit through reducing the fuel height adjacent to your fire break so that you can kind of get by with a smaller break. So, for example, here we have we're prepping a small unit of about a grass that's about 3 foot tall, something like that, and we're putting in about a 5 foot fire break. So we already know if we have 3 foot tall vegetation, we're going to need about a 10 foot fire break. But our cultivator's 5 feet wide. We don't necessarily want to cultivate and disturb a full 10 foot area here. So one thing you can do is install a mow line next to them. And so what that mow line does is it doesn't completely remove that vegetation. You still have combustible fuels in there. They're just 3 or 4 inches tall. And so if you ignite this situation, you would ignite right on the break between your actual fire break that's down to mineral soil and this mow line. And so with a 3 or 4 inch tall vegetation, you only need a foot or so of a fire break. And then it's going to burn through this. And as it burns through this low vegetation, it's increasing the width of your fire break. And by the time it hits the taller 3 or 4 foot vegetation, then you've got your full 10 foot distance between your tall grasses and the edge of your fire break. And so this way, just by mowing a line next to your fire break and then igniting, you're creating a 10 foot fire break without having to actually cultivate or get all the way down to mineral soil for the full 10 foot. And this is something that's really commonly done in grassland situations, where you may have a small trail, but you want to have a wider fire break by the time you actually ignite. Now, there's a lot of options for a fire break, and I really love trying to have established fire breaks that we don't have to install every time at every burn. So I like to look for natural fire breaks. It could be a cliff or a bluff, a creek, as long as the creek's wide enough and is not full of leaf litter. It can certainly serve as a fire break. The edge of a lake, something like that as a natural feature can really work well for a fire break. Permanently established fire breaks that aren't natural, so the field border with a harvested field, a yard that's regularly mowed, so it's just short green grass that's really not going to burn. A road, roads are my favorite fire breaks because they're so easy. So a gravel road or something like that. An established trail on your land, that's another really good fire break that's permanently established. And then if you have to, you can do temporary fire breaks. So temporary fire breaks be ones that are created just for the burn. You're not keeping them maintained as a fire break. You're just putting them in before the burn. You're using them for the burn, and then you're letting that what happen to them. And then there's some green fire breaks, and that's popular with some folks. And so a green fire break would be where you have plant a cover crop planted. It could be clover or something that's really green, dense growing, and that basically creates a non-combustible green fuel type that you put in there. So it's less likely to burn than some dry vegetation or something. So I've seen those used from time to time as well. But again, these roads are one of my favorites, right? So this is a road, a 12 or 15 foot tall road, wide road, very, very easy to use. It's already established, it's already maintained, it's non-combustible with it's just a gravel road. And so there's really little to no prep needed. You can just use the road right away, ignite right off of it, and then you're off to the races. And it could be a small road like this, that's a public road. It could be interior roads or interior trails on your property work really well. So when you have those, if you can design and lay out your fire units to take advantage of any of these kind of permanent fire breaks, it's a great way to kind of make it easier to burn and have kind of stronger, safer fire lines. Sometimes if some of your interior roads are small. Sometimes they do get covered in leaf litter, so it doesn't mean that if you have an interior road or interior trail that you can use it without any prep. So in this case right here, this one, obviously you can see there's a lot of leaves crossing it. So it would not necessarily be adequate enough at this point for a fire break. You're going to have to come in and remove those fuels down to mineral soil before you could use this one as a fire break. But because it's already in this state, it should be a lot easier to do than just putting one through existing vegetation. So here's one you can see it was a little trail. There's definitely some grass growing in it still, but most of the dry vegetation was removed, so it's still working as a fire break. This is a very easy one. This is a little prairie unit that we burn here at the Ag Center where I work, and it's just mowed lawn around the whole thing. And so that allows us to really burn this any day we want without any prep because we know we've got 3 to 4 inch mowed vegetation around it always, and it's just ready to go, ready to burn, and it makes for a very easy fire break. Now, in terms of tools, when you're installing a fire break, if you're in a forest situation, you're burning mostly leaf litter, you can put in fire breaks with hand tools. So it could be some of the rakes, a council rake, a McLeod, even a yard rake or a hoe if that's what you have. You can use those and they are handy, but really what we use now almost exclusively to put in these fire breaks in leaf litter is a leaf blower. A backpack leaf blower is one of the most amazing tools for putting in fire breaks. It's fast, it's easy, and you can really install a temporary fire break or clean up a trail or something very, very fast with a leaf blower. You may at times want to come in and follow with one of these rakes to remove any heavy sticks or anything that the leaf blower didn't get. But I would say most people now are using these leaf blowers and leaf litter burns just because it's so quick and easy to install a fire break. So in this picture here, this was one burn we were doing at a nature preserve, and you can see we had two leaf blowers walking ahead, creating this about 5 foot, 6 foot fire break, and then my job was following behind them with a rake and then removing any bigger roots, any sticks or anything like that that's crossing it, so we could get all the way down to mineral soil. And it was so fast, it was almost as fast as we could walk, right? So it was a very, very quick operation with the three of us putting in a fire line very, very efficiently. And so this is a little trail that normally is covered in leaves, and you can see up there in the upper right, we have this about a 5 foot fire line that was blown in. You can see there it's down to mineral soil, and it did a great job of containing this fire easily. So on the left is an established trail kind of at the top of a hill. And so that's kind of nice where we came in, did a leaf blower, cleared off this trail, made a very, very nice fire break, and then it was downhill from there. So we had this slow backing fire from the fire break down the hill. And so we let it back for a long time before lighting the fire at the bottom of the hill. So we had a very, very safe situation. It was easy to clean up the fire break just with a leaf blower ahead of time. The one on the right is more of a temporary fire break where we wanted to divide this unit into a couple of smaller units to burn it. And we didn't have a trail or anything established, so we just put a leaf blow line right down the middle of the hill. You can see there's a little loose talus and rocks in there, but it was a temporary fire break that we put in just for the burn. Now, tools for grassland burns are a little different. It's usually requires a little more heavier equipment to make it easier if you can, and not as many hand tools, basically. So often we use a mower or a brush hog, bush hog, something like that on the back of a tractor, a disc or a cultivator. Those are some of the kind of tools that are often used for installing fire breaks in grasslands. And so if you're fire breaking it for a grassland burn is just mowing, if you just have a bush hog or even a riding lawn mower, you can have regularly mowed areas where you maintain it as short grass. If, as long as you do that and you're maintaining it in that short vegetation, there's very little thatch buildup, and those can actually be pretty good fire breaks. If it's an infrequently mowed area, so you're mowing taller grass, the problem with that a lot of times is that you'll get a lot of thatch created from mowing down that taller vegetation, and as that thatch dries up, it's going to impede, or it's not going to impede, but it's going to create a situation where the fire could move across your break. So you need to clear that thatch or remove that thatch either through raking, leaf blowing it or something like that to get it out of there before that would be useful for as a break, right? So you'd want the grass in regularly mowed areas to be short, 3 inches or less, and you want to remove that thatch. This is a picture of a landowner I know that has several little prairie units, and he maintains the fire breaks and just mows them regularly while he's mowing the rest of his property. You can see in here the small units. And so it makes it very, very easy for him to burn these units because they're basically always prepped because they have this regularly mowed short grass between all of his little blocks. And it's very easy for him to do, right? Same thing with this. This is a little bit of public land. You can see a grassland unit with the pond in the middle, but all along the perimeter is about a 15-foot trail that is just regularly mowed when they mow all the other trails in this public land. And so it creates a permanent fire break along the edge with short vegetation. Just another shot here of a different unit, a grassland unit. It has a fairly narrow um, uh, fire break, especially for grass. One on the opposite side of the fire break is fairly flammable fuels. And so this is a situation where you would definitely want to be careful here. Make sure your wind is in the right direction and go very slow, and use that backing fire to widen out that fire break as slow as you can to be as safe in this situation. So here's the unit again that we mowed. You can see this was already tall grass. It was not an established trail. And so you can just see in there, in the trail that we mowed, there's a lot of thatch, right? And so this is not an adequate fire break. This would not stop a fire. It would creep through this fairly easily on us. But coming in and following it up after that thatch dries down a little bit with a leaf blower or a rake or something like that and removing that thatch, you're starting to see a lot of bare soil in there and it's becoming a better and better fire break. So that's mowing. Kind of one step up a little better would be disking or plowing. And so the nice thing about disking and plowing is it does expose mineral soil, and mineral soil is kind of the gold standard, right? It's not going to burn. It exposes that. A single pass with either a disc or a plow is you're still likely to have a lot of continuous fuels in there, so it's going to take multiple passes really to get that full fire break where it's down to mineral soil, right? Or you're going to have to clear the thatch or a little bit of both. So here's one pass through a grass situation with a disc. It cut a lot of the grass. It started to break it up, but you can see it is not at all adequate as a fire break. But after a couple, three passes, you're starting to see it look a lot better, right? It's starting to look more like a fire break, a lot more mineral soil. That thatch has been incorporated into the dirt, and you're getting where you need to be by that point. This is a picture of a disc line. I think it had we did two disc lines through it, or we two passes over it. You can still see the lines there. And then it was a few weeks before we got a chance to burn. You can actually see there's new grass growing in there, but the fire is actually creeping through this burn, right? It was the two passes was not enough to get rid of all that thatch. The green grass isn't necessarily what's burning; it's all that thatch. But you can see in the top of the picture the fire is moving through this fire break. It is not adequate to contain that fire. Whereas this one, there's a little bit of thatch in there, but overall, there's a lot of bare soil. I would probably still want to run by this with a leaf blower and knock some of this thatch off. But other than that, it's really starting to look like a good fire break. This was a plow or a big disc. They came in and they were burning an agricultural field on the right and ran the disc along the edge to create a fire break. And you can see just by looking at it, there's a lot of grass in there. It is not necessarily always going to be an adequate fire break. There may be a risk of moving the fire moving through just because the disking didn't really chop up and break up enough of that grass. And sure enough, as I was walking along the edge of this field, I eventually came to a place that looked like this. So on the right was the burn unit, and then you can see the fire line in the middle, and on the left was the area that was not supposed to be burned. But the fire crept through the fire break and escaped and created a spot fire. So they would have greatly benefited from an additional pass or two with the disc in this case to create a better fire break before burning this agricultural field. All right, so cultivating is very, very effective. And so, like we said, it takes multiple passes of a disc to get down to mineral soil. Mowing doesn't get down to mineral soil at all, but cultivating, usually if you use a rototiller or one of these things, you're going to get down to mineral soil in your first pass. And that's the nice thing about it. though it is a little slower. You have to drive your tractor slower. It's impacted if you have rocky soils and things like that. You're not going to be able to use this. And it's limited in width. They usually don't make these that very wide, but it does do a great job, especially in lower grass. So you'd probably want to mow ahead of time to lower the grass down and lower the thatch down before using one of these. But it usually does create a very, very uh, thorough fire break, as you can see here, where it's just absolutely down to mineral soil in there. And so I really like using a cultivator, at least for one pass, and then maybe adjacent to it mowing, like we talked about earlier. Um, they tend to work very, very well. So here's this picture again. You can see a single pass with the cultivator adjacent to a mow line makes a really, really nice um, fire break that way. And so this was a cultivated line, and then a few weeks later we had some grass regrowth, but it's mostly green grass, and so it was not that combustible, and so it still held up as a really nice fire break. And in fact, we did a little demonstration in this area where we put in different fire breaks. So we put in cultivated lines, disc lines, and mow lines in the same field, down the middle of this field, and then we burned the field to kind of see what the lines would do. So we burned both sides of each line, and we wanted to know, would the fire creep through the line, or did the fire break itself maintain itself through that, even though we burned the entire field? And so I have a little video, and as we go through this video, watch, we'll start with the cultivated lines, move to the disc lines, and then move to the mode lines, and you can see the difference in terms of how well you can still identify our fire breaks. Did they burn or did they not? So you should be seeing these first two lines are cultivated. You can see they're green, they're continuous, they're straight. The fire did not get into those lines whatsoever. These next two lines are disc lines. You can still see the lines of disc in there, but you can also see several places where the fire moved across these lines. And the next two are mow lines, and it's even hard to see the lines because the fire moved through them almost everywhere, right? And so very, very clear differences in how well the different techniques performed, which with each of those installation techniques. All right, so that's tools and methods for grassland burns. We talked about forest burns. A couple things here, wet lining as a technique for a fire line. And so if you're not familiar with wet lining, it's spraying the fuels that are immediately adjacent to your burn unit. So you're spraying the fuels in your fire line immediately before ignition. So you put the wet line in and immediately follow it up with a drip torch and ignite right at the edge of that wet line. And what that does is either create a very, very temporary fire break, but we usually use it to improve an existing fire break. So if you have a fire break that has some fuels in it, has some grass in it, then you're worried about um, the fire creeping through, you can put a wet line in first just to kind of increase the performance of that fire break. And it basically, as you put the fire down, it's going to burn into the fuels, but it's going to put itself out as it tries to burn into your line because the fuels are wet. So obviously it uses a lot of water. So you would do this in cases where you have access with a UTV or a tractor or something that you can use the water to put it down on the ground. But this is a very, very good technique to dealing with lines that are not typically otherwise adequate, right? That have some issues with them. And that's what happened in this situation. You can see this is a little wildlife planting in here. It was a mowed line, and you can see that there's quite a bit of grass in this line. And so in this case, we were not confident with this fire break that it would stop this fire. And we knew it would be a lot of work for the burn crew to kind of stop the fire from constantly creeping through this line. So luckily we had an ATV with a small water unit on it. And so by putting in a wet line right along the edge through this fire break and then immediately igniting, in fact, you can see the person still igniting on the other end of the picture. The fire break held much easier. The fire went into the unit but put itself out as it tried to creep into that wet fuel in the line, and made our job as a burn crew just so much easier, just by spending a few minutes putting in that wet line. And then here is the igniter kind of at the other end of this. You can see the grass in the fire break, but we still had that wet line in there, and it did a great job. Now, sometimes you can even use no line, or no wet line. So this is a case where we have, again, that mowed grass. You can see the grass is brown, so the fire definitely will creep into that low grass, but there's very little danger of it moving fast. And so what we did in this case was just go ahead and light the fire. The fire was really intense. It was hot right next to it. So we just held back the crew and let the fire move through into the unit, get a little ways away from us, and so the fire right at the edge was cool, and we didn't really mind that fire creeping into this grass a little bit. It didn't bother us, and so we just waited until it was a little cooler. We could access it a little better, and then just put out those creeping fires at that point in time because we didn't really need to have a sharp line. We could let it creep and move, and so after the fire, you could see places where the fire did creep into the grass a little bit, but we really weren't that worried about that, right? So it just allowed us to burn easily. We didn't need to put the wet line down ahead of time. We didn't need to really prep that much. We could just tolerate a little creeping because we knew it was a safe in this instance. In terms of dealing with snags and jackpots, so a snag is a dead standing tree. In this case, we could also consider live trees if they have exposed dead wood, hollows, or wounds that are close to the ground that would risk fire catching into those areas. So all of those would be a big risk. And that's really when they're close to the fire line, and they are very risky because they can pull that fire up into the up into that dead tree, and then just create a situation where the tree could fall across our fire break, or it could throw embers more since it's so high. So we really do take snags seriously. They're one of these risks to spreading fires. And then jackpots are just piles of heavy fuels. It could be down trees, logging slash, brush piles, or something like that close to the fire line. It just creates a more intense fire close to the line and increases the chances of our fire from escaping, right? And so these are things that you want to be careful of and take action to kind of protect them when they occur along a fire break. So here's a couple. Just the one on the left was a lightning strike tree. It was actually still alive, but it had this dead wood along the lightning strike area, and it caught fire and then carried itself up into the canopy of the tree. And then the one on the right is a hollow tree that the inside of it caught. And again, having these in the interior of your burn unit, way into the interior, is not really that big of a deal. But when there's a snag or something like that next to your fire line, your fire break, it creates a situation where it can be very hazardous to leave it. You're going to have to either cut it down when it's burning, which is also very hazardous, or try to put it out, which creates a lot more work. So a lot of times we want to treat these snags in such a way so that they do not get on fire when they're close to the burn unit, because we don't want to have to deal with those. And on living trees, it can create an opportunity to kill living trees because if it's a wound on that tree or someplace like that, even though the tree is otherwise healthy, it could lead to a lot of damage to the tree. So what we like to do is remove the vegetation, any kind of fuels around or clear around the snags when those snags occur within 2 tree lengths of the fire break. Now, you either completely remove the tree by cutting the snag down or thoroughly clearing around them to kind of create your own little fire break around those down to mineral soil out to 3 to 4 feet at a minimum around those dead trees. Pay attention to those shallow dead roots because sometimes they can catch fire and then carry into the trunk as well. If it's very troublesome, you have very troublesome snags that are just really worried about that are close to your fire line, you can consider actually changing the location of your fire line and working around those so that you're not going to burn them. either way. But it's really important as you're starting to lay out a fire to clearly mark those snags around the fire line so your burn crew can monitor them, that you know to look out for them during the burn. So you want to pay extra attention to those and make sure that they're not igniting. So here's a couple of examples for a fire we recently did. The one on the left is a dead ash tree. So that's a dead standing snag. So we marked it when we saw it with some flagging so we could come in and clear around that tree. The one on the right is a post oak. It's a live, healthy tree, but you can see there's this large wound at the bottom of it. So that could certainly be an avenue for a fire to get in and start burning the inside of this tree out. So we marked it as one to clear around as well. So again, you would definitely want to completely clear around that vegetation. As you can see here, use a rake or something, and then have down the mineral soil around, again, 3 to 4 feet around that snag so that it's not going to get combusted, right? It's not going to catch on fire. Here's another example of one here where we cleared around it. And then another one after the fire, you can see burned everywhere around it, but we have that dirt right next to it, so the fire did not get close to that snag. So again, within 2 tree lengths. So if you've got a 60-foot snag that occurs within 120 foot of that fire line, that's when you want to clear around, right? Just clear around it so you do not want that one to catch fire. If it's 300 or 400 feet inside of your fire unit, then it's up to you. If it's uphill, you still may want to treat it because you don't want it to burn and then roll downhill. But you've got a little leeway in deciding what to do in those cases. Now, jackpot fuels, again, these are like big piles of fuel, like whether it's down trees or brush piles. You can break them up to and spread them out a little bit, so that just reduces their intensity. Move them further into the unit or further out of the unit, one or the other. Or if it's such a big pile of fuel, you can consider moving your fire break or breaking up those continuous fuels. Do something so that you don't have that pressure of a hot burning fire right next to your fire break. It's only going to increase the chances that that you're gonna lose that fire and it's going to spread. So breaking them up, big pile, brush piles like this, pushing them farther in, breaking them apart, moving your fire break, something like that is what you would definitely want to do to just again to lessen the pressure on your fire break. Some other considerations when you're installing a fire break, fences or other impediments near a fire break can complicate your burn activities. And then the big thing is it can restrict access or escape. You don't want to have a 4-strand barbed wire fence right next to your fire break if your burn crew needs to get over top of it to deal with a spot, or if something happens and then they need to escape away from the fire, you wouldn't want to have this here. So you want to make sure that you place your fire breaks where you have some room to move, or consider removing fences if they're not necessary in that place. But you want to definitely consider crew safety when you're laying out and deciding where to put your fire break. And fences are definitely something that need to be considered just again for safety or for access for sure. And then not piling up fuels, spreading them out, thinking of things like uh, piles of tall grass or brush piles where you're controlling invasives. Some of these things that you'd want to consider siting them in the right place so they're not against your fire break. And lastly, just some things. So when you're doing this, if you're mowing, disking, or cultivating lines, you'd want to install them several weeks in advance to allow time for that thatch to dry down, and then come back and check them right before the burn. So either remove the thatch, touch up your lines, or do something like that. For fire breaks and leaf litter, you can install them in advance. That's okay, but you would definitely need to touch them up that day. And then any fire break the day you're going to burn, you should definitely, the burn boss needs to walk or drive the entirety of the entire fire break. It needs to be assessed completely the day before the burn or the day of the burn, right before the burn, just to make sure nothing has changed. You don't want to assess it a week ahead of time and then show up and burn it because there might have been a tree fall across it, or there could have been a windstorm that blew a lot of leaves in there. So again, any fire break needs to be completely assessed right before the burn, by walking or driving the entirety of that fire break. That's one of the jobs of that burn boss, to make sure that those fire breaks are adequate for the burn before you ever put fire on the ground. So I hope this was useful. I'm open for questions. I just kind of wanted to cover some things to think about, and some design, kind of rules of thumb with fire breaks, so that hopefully it'll help you, um, moving forward when you start to install your own fire breaks.